Hello everyone, today we talk about the Condottieri. Not just the Italian Condottieri, because as you know, especially the first time of this era, that is roughly a couple of centuries long, was dominated by foreigners in the Italian peninsula. Nevertheless, the military system developed by the Italians throughout all the period, because also these foreign companies were largely an Italian creation, we will explain how, representing in fact one of the peculiar Italian way to what is actual modern warfare, in that for a long time accomplice like the anti-condottieri prejudices of Machiavelli, such an unavoidably impacting voice in military history, were considered inefficient, obsolete, anachronistic, etc. It is not to say that at the end of the period, of course, Italy was not undergoing a massive political crisis that was reflected by the same Italian wars, and so largely the affirmation of foreign control over large swaths of the peninsula. However, this would not take into account, a bit like for other countries, the at least modern national politics of these places, and so specifically the fact that there were some pretty robust Italian states, such as Venice, for example, was pioneering, in fact, the development in European military organization together with the Burgundian state in the generation before, but a more general will by the same Italians to allow such power sharing to happen, which is actually a constant throughout the history of the peninsula until, in fact, the same Italian unification that also happened without too many issues after all, in especially considering in hindsight like the outcome of such national state. Now, as you know, we talk about a lot of things historically, so these topics can be easily intertwined with so many others as we've seen. Just recently we talked, in fact, about the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Italians during World War I. Just yesterday I talked also about essentially the German military strategy between the unification of Germany and the Great War. All this must be seen in such perspective. In fact, that's why I also invite, other than just for marketing reasons, my followers to be aware of the fact that it's useless to select a specific video based on subject or whatever, because all what I make is deeply intertwined and you can't quite grasp the best of these analyses without listening to the others. I think that today we will cover all the Condottieri era in a single video, which is sort of a gigantic enterprise, at least in advance, compared to being the moment I'm recording, whether I will pull this feed off or not. Nevertheless, it's a massive topic, and I realized over the years that, in spite we talked a lot about the Italian communal armies and the general underestimation that I always, as repeatedly, in fact, point out, bring on the fore regarding those, which is a major issue, and I'm also involved, as you know, I specialize in the Holy Roman Empire, in German, in Italian history, also outside of Schwerpunkt, and that's why precisely I care about that, but also because I see the relevance in objective perspective. However, we haven't talked so much about 14th and 15th century Italy, so the peak of the Condottieri era, for which I decided to start another branch of the cycle through the exhaustion of some of them that will focus exactly on the Italian signories / lordships, whatever you want to call them, in very much ultra depth. You've noticed that also in the regional historical series I haven't, for example, ever covered, the great late medieval Italian houses, the great signories of that era, the Este, the Gonzaga, just to stick also to the smaller ones at a point. They're very important as far as, in fact, as the Condottieri are concerned as well. We hardly ever talk about the same Medici. Everything is gradually being uploaded, right? But it's important to strengthen the bulk, the basics, the fundamentals of that era, and especially as a military-based channel. I think that making a comprehensive video about the Condottieri is very important. Also, considering that I'm not really influenced by other people's work, but I see that, of course, people discuss these things, and of course they do it from much more entertaining channels than mine. But I still think that it's quite difficult to nail the point of it all unless you actually concentrate in a very thorough fashion that naturally people are also less likely to listen to, but that again with time you can call. So we will give a general introduction to the Condottieri era in a chronological order, and then we will point out some features of these Condottieri. Because when you look actually at the condotta itself, and so the essential military contract that was stipulated between, say, a certain authority and the various military companies in their gradual development, well, this is not really to the bone, actually, any different from what was happening in the rest of Europe. This was happening in Germany, was happening, I don't know, think about the English indenture, was happening in Spain, in France, it's pretty much everywhere. And we have, in fact, discussed this also in recent videos. Remember the one about the European minor nobility as the backbone of the continental armies, all that stuff. Well, it has a lot to do with these topics, so it's why it's important to look at the single regions and sort of mark a bit the differences, and why were the Italian condottieri so famous or infamous. And I will not today deal with the broader historiographical issue of the story, because there is not just, of course, the very burdensome Machiavelli's legacy about the condottieri, but also, I don't know, the 19th century nation-stato, romantic vision of the story. There is, in this sense, like I would say, the only part of medieval Italian warfare that is adequately popularized is exactly the condottieri era, that, however, is often sort of dramatized, taken out of context. They used to say, why did they come out exactly in this place? It's not simply the fact, yes, as a general point, that Italy was as rich as politically divided, unless, in fact, you understand the characteristics of these powers and the nature of the condottieri itself. Why were they different from, say, other companies outside of Europe that, even when fighting in Italy, fought on different terms, let's put it in this way, than they would have done wherever they came from. And of course, at some point we will cover all the technicalities of the historical military units that we can make from the magnificent, and here visually displayed in the video, amount of course, Italian art, iconography, archaeology, arms and armor. Just recently, as you know, I made a video about Milanese armor. And so this is how the Middle Ages are beautiful to be covered, like step by step, one thing at a time. So you can say a lot about the condottieri, skilled fighters, but also intellectuals, daring adventurers, and astute entrepreneurs. Right? That's how multifaceted across these centuries this veritable institution at the end of the day became. The Italian condottieri represent definitely also a glorious exception in military history for the connection that naturally Italy had with its classical past, the revaluation of the same, the new Renaissance ideals revolving around these veritable heroes. That is something that we tend also to underestimate. I made a couple of videos about the Renaissance in those terms, and we will talk more about this topic also in the representation of the condottieri statues. I made a very old video that I haven't re-uploaded with, say, better picture years ago on the topic, but there is also a philosophy, a worldview that comes together with it. So we have necessarily to begin from the beginning, right? And what's the beginning? There is no beginning for real, except, of course, as historians we can approximate around the mid-12th century. So during the Hohenstaufen revival, of the Germanic power within the Holy Roman Empire, the famous Austrian bishop Otto of Freising, quite deeply, connected with the Swabian house, during those very expeditions undertook a journey through the cities of northern Italy, right, of the Italic kingdom, Lombardy mostly, where he observed the prevalence of a previously unknown form of political and social organization. Of course, we're talking about the Communes, that I dedicated a vast amount of time and energies to on Schwerpunkt. There is a pretty, in fact, hefty playlist if you're interested in those, and the history also of every single Italian city, at least, that is still in theory, but that can really help, and it's really the only way you can learn this stuff. It's like saying, I don't know, this is very much the case for the Holy Roman Empire, for Italian, even more German history, depending on what you want to stress. I mean, all these states essentially being part of also broader kingdoms and feudal hierarchies that, however, gained a great deal of autonomy and independence de facto. This is especially the case of the Italian city-states. And the communes at this point were essentially ramping up their entire civilizational capacity, including the military one. And when Otto of Freising, remember, we're in the mid-12th century, so Germany is even at this point before like the full feudalization based on the Western Frankish model that Frederick Barbarossa was exactly enacting only at this point, right? In large swaths here, Otto came from some of the most developed, rich, Romanized areas of Germany. So he was aware, of course, like of the peaks of the aristocratic and chivalric culture that the Germans sort of incarnated at that point, which was an important also civilizational achievement. Of course, in comparison to Italy, things were really, really very, very different. And Otto's remarks are, in fact, very famous in medieval historiography exactly for this, because in Lombardy, feudalism seemed almost a distant memory, which is a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but indeed society appeared to be based on something very different from Transalpine Europe. From one side, you can stress like the commercial aspects, like the material wealth of the Italian communes, the figure of the merchant, the third estate. But this is reductive. It's a point that I often make, like the idea of the Italian communes being just, mercantile republics does not render justice, especially like actually at this point to the, not just the Romano-Germanic roots of this sort of citizen fighter that these communities had been founded upon, but properly the presence of a knightly estate that did rule the communes, except doing so from a different social background, the one north of the Alps, because essentially these knights were such due to census. Many of them, of course, descended from the great feudal houses that at some point the same Franks and Saxons had sort of men appointed with their own military retinues back in the day, but also descending from the local Romance, Longobards of Stratum, and that were incredible. This was really what caused major cultural shock, aside from all the rest, dictating rule to imperial vassals from the communes that were basically not just monstrous entities as far as the size, right, and power they had achieved, but truly an innovative one, right? One that had not been previously sanctioned by the imperial authority, that now had to confront them exactly as they had fundamentally created an order on their own, one that from a German perspective would seem like upside down. Consider also like the cultural, the ethnic divide. These people do not really speak the same language. Actually, in the higher Middle Ages, indeed, Italy and Germany were much more intertwined than we used to think, and this was still like pretty much an era in which indeed the two peoples knew each other pretty well, so because there had never been like a moment of real eclipse of imperial, of German authority. This was intermittent. It never really had never really led to a direct control of the entire peninsula, and it, generally speaking, was accepted by the same, otherwise in fact proud imperial subjects that, however, had been working and fighting hard for creating these autonomies, these communities, and were incredibly proud also about their civic identity, their municipal accomplishments, and of course were not simply to give away what they had obtained through so much hardships. I have many videos about the various Italic reigns of different Germanic rulers during this period. You know where to find. Otto Freising, for this reason, also noted some sort of vivid anti-monarchical sentiments that were not really intended in an anti-traditional sense, rather the fact that the population, alongside a strong push for this essentially republican self-governance, regarded this system as a source of justice and synonymous with good administration, therefore not being willing to let it being administered by a higher authority, at least in terms of direct interference and seizure of the largest proportion of resources, which is actually what now the Hohenstaufen were sort of committed in doing in a centralistic policy that, as you know, the Lombards fiercely and ultimately successfully resisted. Consider that the cultural shock was increased by things like, the disproportionate per capita wealth was the largest in the world, and it would remain until the 17th century, uninterruptedly since the Roman Empire in these regions. The highest level of literacy, right? The juridical studies, the level of, again, of transactions, and also of military organization, which figure prominently, very strong bulk of free citizens in the original Romano-Germanic tradition, something that had actually been lost, where you would think, say intuitively, to have maybe remained the greatest that is north of the Alps, where instead, a princely feudal system had been affirmed, whereby essentially who had been a freeman that largely fallen under somebody else's control, whether the count, the bishop, like Otto Freising, again being part of that higher nobiliar reality. And of course, there was more to that to sort of fuel the struggle, because again, the divide, the conflict would not, as you know, escalate much on a national basis as whole. That partially contributed as a general, geographical counterposition, but of course, here we are looking at post-Worms, at post-investiture controversies, at least initial settlement times, whereby the papacy had won at least the right for the first investiture of the bishops in Italy, right? Whereas the emperor had retained it north of the Alps. Burgundy was a bit, contested by both. But of course, there was a lot of, look, these are the people who essentially caused that, right? And they're leaving this, at least from a monarchical and narrow feudal elite standpoint, something that is essentially an affront to that same culture. Actually, the Italians were much more sort of traditional, knightly and military inclined. That, in fact, the stereotype that mostly gets down to some sort of, again, of first estate or second estate against a third one. Right, that's not exactly how the system worked. We've seen this in videos like, the one on the commune of Cremona, for example, that actually, contested in arms the same golden globe of the Holy Roman Emperors by the hands of this Lombard men at arms. So it's actually a much more interesting picture than, and also one that does technically align, also from a strictly military point of view. If you look at the developments of, arms and armor fighting styles. We've seen it many times. I made a video about the King Arthur's relief on Modena Cathedral, like a typical 12th century Western European knightly armament that is identical, in fact, to the French, to the German one. Nevertheless, this was still the Italy of the free communes, right? Or at least the de facto free communes, a place where the roots of the Renaissance, notoriously, even just from an artistic point of view, if you look at the masterpieces of the time, took hold, right? There is already that sense of light, of Apollonian, of classical that is emerging from the local Romano-Germanic and still heavily Byzantine influenced heart. Before this land could evolve into the cultural and artistic phenomenon that would transform all of Europe in the better, in this sense, known Renaissance period, it had, of course, to first develop alongside the great expansion of Western civilization in these centuries. At this point, the Italian communes, we explained it many times, were not real city-states yet, right? They had already more advanced features of the other European cities, but they had not unified in a political sense, like the city control on the district, etc. This was the moment. In fact, also from a military point of view, the local centers are much more directly involved as far as their citizens are to the military expedition of the communal army. And this is, in fact, a period historiographically contraposed to the one of the Condottieri, because the latter was at some point dominated by Italians still, but in a post mid 14th century crisis, which is essentially an ancien regime, sort of an elite system. And in the first half of the 14th century and slightly before, with at least a massive and actually prevalent foreign element also that was subordinated to the Italian one, to the Italian command, and the other, in fact, local elements of the army. We discussed this again also recently in that video about the Guelphs and the Ghibellines during the Pax and the Gavenses, the second half of the 13th century. And naturally, already at this point, many industrious local realities gradually amassed great wealth, which became concentrated among the urban elites, but not only, again, because remember that there is a very egalitarian distribution of wealth, the greatest in the world at this time. These elites not only competed for internal power, but also participated in the struggle between the empire and the papacy, seeking greater autonomy and profit for themselves. And exactly thanks to this advanced, highly, properly civilized culture that rendered these polities ever more self-aware, especially in the international arena, right? Because, of course, they were fighting against one another to assert, in fact, their own power, but as we've seen also in the videos about the Italian financial hegemony, also after the mid-14th century crisis, still fundamentally the centrality in the Italian banking in Europe and the Mediterranean. And so really fueling also war in other countries, right? Serving the ambitions of great kings such as Edward I, Philip IV. So an enterprising yet conflict-ridden Italy was emerging, a promised land of opportunities for those with the ambition and boldness to seize them. While in other parts of Europe, national communities were forming that anticipated modern states, Italy fostered an opposite perspective, at least in a certain sense, that valued local, communal, urban identities precariously maintained through complex diplomatic and military operations. Technically, the Italic kingdom did exist, and of course there was a nominal connection with sort of the Germanic Empire in that sense, but in order to command in these lands, you had to descend from the Alps. There were massive expeditions, extremely costly ones, and ultimately during the wars of the Lombard League, like not really succeeding in subjecting the region. Then, as we'll see now, today we talk about the entire peninsula, because of course the Condottieri involved like the entire scenario, which is very interesting, of course, and in that peculiar way that is also slightly different from the otherwise some basic sense of rise of mercenarism in the rest of Europe. What is fascinating of Italy at this point is that Italians in Italy regard themselves all as, I don't know, Milanese, Venetians, Bolognese, Florentine, depending on where they come from. But when they are abroad, they're known as the Italians. They're known at least as the Lombards. Since the early Middle Ages, a pretty unitary identification of these lands, of these peoples, of their language, and so on. And so this is why, for example, all these communes are so similar to one another, right? Institutionally speaking, they're an exception in Europe. You can't even say it's simply an exception, because essentially 1/4 of Europeans were Italian at this point. It was an incredibly, again, endemically crowded land. It still is, technically, in Europe, also as a consequence of this urbanization. And for this reason, like their context, if you look at all the war that was raging in these lands, it's still, pouring out resources to fight them. You can't help but understand how much of an hybrid existed between all these finally city-states by the mid-13th century that in fact had developed their institutions in parallel, in the same generation with one another, in spite of being chronically divided. So this is a very interesting dynamic that must be stressed when you study Italian history, because the idea of this unity is, say, true in a formal political sense, but you must understand also to which extent, I don't know, by the 1400s, you can argue that Italy was a much more united land overall than, say, Germany, for example. But you wouldn't say that maybe because there is a greater contemporary sort of bias in terms of which national identities you sort of care about the most in Europe. You don't see that the Europeans at large, actually, more or less on the same basis of today's national identities, geographically wise, were already there. And Italians also quite prepotently so, considering all their sort of the stark sort of detachment also from the other peoples in the sheer level of achievements at this point in any practically field of activity. So the ruthless German mercenaries played a prominent role in the affirmation of the condotta. Right. First of all, little disclaimer: the condotta, we'll see it also a bit better, is just a simple hiring contract. Right. It's just like the integer. It's just a contract. I hire you. Initially, the term, I think, initially starts in the 13th century, because they already existed before. We made lots of videos about medieval mercenaries also in the earlier centuries. But of course, it's only in these areas that we have sort of the better documentation that also reflects a more organized military structure. And essentially, this is the product of the monetization of, say, the more traditional forms of military service that you can find also in other countries. I don't know, in England there is the famous scutage, right? But it worked like in the same ways also in other countries all around. And so the Italians mostly had this, if anything, more literate bias because of the greater level of transaction, of money running around. And so this greater also preservation of these contracts, the development of the same conditions under which these men had to serve. Now, the Germans were around from quite some time, as we pointed out before. You can argue that the German presence in Italy had always existed. You can argue it since Roman times, and not just through the settlement of entire Germanic peoples in the Italian peninsula, but since Augustus had the German bodyguards in his imperial household. The connections again between Central Europe, the Italian peninsula, are incredibly old, and there are certain dynamics also during the Condottieri period that definitely resemble, especially in the first half of the 14th century, the same migration year. In many ways, these peoples had already been formed for a very long time. They have such a greater continuity in what they do and how they do it from millennia. It is still true in many ways till today, regardless of the ever more accelerated sort of change that one can philosophize upon. Now, why were the Germans so useful, and especially for the Italians? Well, first of all, again, there was this Holy Roman Imperial connection that had always brought Germanic elements into the peninsula on its own. Still, the feudal system, the Ghibellines relied in part on this imperial chancellors and their retinues. This is true also for other nationalities, as we will see now. Germany is also a big country. It's actually bigger than today's contemporary boundaries, and it's starting to be very populated. Like, it has a tumultuous growth. By the 14th century, it reaches the same Italy, which is a big deal. Except it's, as we remember before, a heavily feudalized country, and this system, on the longer run, brings not just to the privatistic failure of the German national monarchy. I mean, France makes it, England makes it, also the Spanish make it to their internal Iberian extent. Germany basically implodes, right? And there is another territorial recomposition dynamic that is also in fact similar to the one that happens in Italy under some princely power that creates some provincial regional states that, however, affirm themselves on the traditional ministerialis class that basically loses its relevance by that period, because the princes affirm themselves with, in fact, also their own kind of mercenaries. There are some, same Germans, but under very different conditions than sort of the military servile, but also privileged by the 13th century once the ministerialis had enjoyed. Right. So Germany is also a more primitive, brutal, warlike country to an extent. At least the Germans do not really know an eastern boundary in history. Like, Germany is open to the broader east. It's a tumultuous land where there is all this warfare. And if anything, the sense that the Germans are great shock chargers, for example, they have this very strong Western culture that now starts rivaling even with the French one. Plus this sense of entitlement that they have as now identifying as Romans, literally, as the detainers of the empire, and all the sort of wealth-Ghibelline struggles occurring in the peninsula, including the loss of the Hohenstaufen private property of the Kingdom of Sicily. They made a video about the Battle of Tagliacozzo there with the tragic epopee of Conradin, etc. Brings them to find opportunities in a land that, as we pointed out, needed fighters, because it was always fighting. It's being estimated by different scholars that Italy was essentially the country that fought the most, like invested the most in war, and that had essentially, in parallel with France, essentially the greatest level of army development, and displayed in often even larger numbers if you account it in a same territorial unit by geographical extension, let's say. And so, especially in a gentrifying phase like the one followed since paradoxically the end, in fact, of the Swabian fortune in Italy that had released so many resources now to allow, in fact, the Italians in part to pay somebody to fight in their stead, right? Which is something that Italians were doing it already among other Italians. Look at the Florentine condotta, for example. This was happening pretty much elsewhere. Exemptions, thing, etc., brings these Teutonic knights in great numbers in the peninsula. We've seen that even before the massive injection occurs during the Raumfahrt of Henry VII, Luxembourg, so we're at the beginning of 14th century, but we've seen, for example, in the video about Monteperti that the Germans were just 800 sent by Manfred of Sicily to assist the Ghibelline Siennese against the Guelph Florentines, were in fact the very good enactors of flank attacks. This is a thing coming. I shall make a video about this. Essentially the level of knightly and chivalric equestrian military culture that the Germans achieved by the 13th century. The idea that they were bulkier guys, especially as far as their arms and armor were concerned. The plate armor is born in Germany, then it spreads essentially along the same all over Europe in the same time frame. But we've seen, for example, in the Battle of Pelagonia, that these German mercenaries were pretty much everywhere. This is also the time in which they start infesting the Scandinavian countries. What is interesting about Italy is not just the size of their numbers, especially from the beginning of the 14th century, but the fact that in spite of their force, the Italians have enough force on their own to fundamentally frame them in a very successful way within their armies as the shock element alongside the other Italian men-at-arms that, however, are ever more oligarchic. They're becoming the patricians of the cities. This is the affirmation of the signori. That it's a moment in which tendentially the same autocrats disarm the populations that are also exhausted because of this continuous warfare. And so the German mercenary is the best solution. And it's almost embarrassing for the Germanic rulers because, for example, when Ludwig, the Bavarian Ludwig IV of Wittelsbach, is about to come to Italy for his expedition, he doesn't really have too many men-at-arms with him because they cost a lot. And basically the Ghibelline Italians tell him, look, we have many more Germans than the ones you can actually control already here under our control, and so we will give you those, and we will say cooperate all together, because largely, especially after the Raumfahrt of Henry VII, these other expeditions, the ones of Ludwig of Bavaria, Charles of Bohemia, are ever more just subsidized by the same Italians. It's not like but already Henry VII, right, in that regard, it was not much of a Germanic imposition on Italy in the attempt to curb it. It was just exploiting as much as possible in the local division and grabbing the Roman crown and still ruling as rightful Germanic rulers. And were actually, also this before, like with Conrad III, Lothar III, we made videos about that, actually a very good cooperation between the Germans and the Italians. German mercenaries, as you know, are famously fighting at the Battle of Civitates early as the mid-11th century. So there are great examples of that continue over time, and in this inter-exchange of European history. If you think about the Normans in southern Italy, for that matter, that they begin as mercenaries as well. There is, as we were saying at the beginning, however, one reason in general we have to find out why the undisputed protagonists of this broader dynamic come to be the Condottieri in general, like a system that institutionalizes also and eventually on an Italian basis. It's essentially a uniquely Italian invention that marked both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance with its peculiar dynamic. So we've seen it, the rapid urbanization, the accumulation of wealth, and the relative weakness of feudal institutions soon stimulated the demand for mercenary military service. The more a city was interested in expanding at the expense of her neighbors, seizing their territories, which is unlike any other city in Europe. Like this is not to be found. This is how and why we're talking about city-states. Say, I don't know, the Flemish towns were not Italian city-states. They did not do that. Like, they could have leagues, they could fight against the sort of feudal authority, but in a way or another, they were framed under it. They still could not essentially overwhelm one another, these Italian communes start conquering one another, especially at the beginning of the 14th century, so creating larger states based not just on a single city, but on the mother city, let's say, and the other ones that she had been able to subject. And so all this obviously brings to the greater need for a military system that extended beyond its city walls, like complete with castles and permanent garrisons. This is only what a state can do, and that's why, again, we look at this community and say, wow, they managed to really create these armies that, again, especially from the second half of the 13th to the mid 14th century, are enormous. They are normally in a regional coalition force of 30,000 men, both for Lombardy and for Tuscany at the same time. So this is insane, because it's what, again, the King of France can put together on his own, right? And this is just like a smaller chunk. It's just like the Po Valley and Tuscany. This is just a section also of the entire Italian peninsula. For example, the Papal States produced an enormous amount of Condottieri. The actual finest ones in later history. Had the Papal States been actually a cohesive monarchic state, they would have surely hegemonized the peninsula with all the manpower. The same Kingdom of Sicily, later Naples, was one of the largest powers in Europe, as a matter of fact. And so you're really looking at the obvious necessity. You have the resources, you have the general will, like to try to recompact this otherwise politically divided territory. That's why you find all these wars. As we pointed out before, the cities provided an abundance of infantry. The cities in a political sense, because naturally also many of these men were from the district, the countryside, but they were also very well equipped. We've seen it. Milan could simply equip at some point. There are interesting studies. The Tuscan Wealth League could keep 800 men at arms just as a reserve, plus 20,000 men, one third equipped with pikes, the other with pavises, and the other with crossbows. The city of Milan alone, this does not take into account the fact that at the time, I think it's 1302, de facto already controls large swaths of Lombardy and so other Lombard cities, requires at least 12,000, its district to provide for at least 12,000 pikemen, right, plus a complement of double-handed axemen and crossbow. And so we're talking about that level of infantry capacity, and always sided by, of course, the dominant men-at-arms. You see, you do not see this type of infantry development anywhere else, but Italy never abandons cavalry as the primary arm, right? Why did, the Flemish towns did and won against the French at Courtrai? It's a great thing, but it's not because they were actually more advanced, more powerful, even in infantry than other parts of Europe. It's just that that's literally all they had. They enjoyed a decentralized position. They exploited well the terrain, being led by feudal lords, the counts of Flanders, as a matter of fact, that had come back from Italy, by the way, and could not even put together like the same quality of troops that instead Philip the Fair hires from Lombards and Tuscans, and that defies the Flemish infantry itself at Tournai, at Rouen. And so really, there is so much here. There is all the intertwinement, say, of Castruccio Castracani, for example, at the court of Edward I. There is, the other day we were talking about the Catalan infantrymen that in part are used by the Italians as well. Basically, they're dismissed without any effect on Italian warfare, because they started hiring all these French and German knights we'll see now. So you can understand, by the way, this infantry largely also maintains the balance of all these foreign and pretty aggressive, right, and effective and terrible. Like they were incredibly violent foreign mercenary cavalrymen. At some point, these forces were so large that they start autonomizing, as we will see now, never actually outside of the Italian control. Essentially, the reason why they were so, like, the age of the soldiers of fortune was so much of a mess, but not just, of course, the immediate aftermath of the mid-14th century crisis. This was happening pretty much everywhere in Europe, except these are old mercenaries that come there and are thrown, essentially, by the various Italian city-states against one another, right, with specific purpose. In fact, what strikes you is that, differently from other places, these mercenaries do not settle down. Basically, they all come back home at a point. Like in Scandinavia, the Germans start ruling literally the country. In Italy, they ravage around. The Italian communes shut the gates. They defend themselves. They do not even need to face them at a point for them to go away and eventually to be dissolved, or at some point also to be crushed, but still used as a very, very profitable pawn against one another. And of course, mess ensues, because this is actually hard warfare, right? We've seen it, I don't know, the other day we were talking about 14th century Hungary. We've seen, of course, the Angevin-Neapolitan connection there. There is the expedition of Ladislaus into Italy, the civil war in the Neapolitan kingdom, and the various interferences later with other Angevins of that same dynasty in, I don't know, the fragmented papal states, etc. But when you look at it, you realize that these bands were not to actually achieve anything that these states were not allowing them to do, including the later institutionalization, which we will see especially at the end with the Venetian Condotta. And still, of course, in parallel with the existence of these colonial forces, right, that were that's important. Like at some point, these mercenaries tried to take over certain cities because, in part, they were garrisoned there, say, in the subjected city of a more powerful one, and somebody has to intervene, because in the city streets, these guys, even though they are the finest men at arms, of course, they are threatened by the local popular militias, and they are, in some cases, also cut down to pieces. This is the case in many cities. Rome, for example, had a very strong popular force. There are similar episodes in Padua. Candrande has to intervene. In Lucca, there is the episode of, we'll see these along the way. In any case, the intensity, as we've seen, of this warfare necessitating the continuous hiring of mercenary troops that, bear in mind, are extremely expensive, right? Hadn't Italy been so rich, that there would have not even technically been such dynamic. We're talking about immense amount of wealth spent in this way. The point that let's say the broader problem that the Italians posed themselves at a point before this multitude of foreigners was either arrived or was properly called at some point independently into France, into Germany, into Burgundy, by the single city-state. Like, this was done very early on, right? Even by, cities in the heart of the Apennine that you wouldn't think, like, these are on their own, right? We're talking the Middle Ages. Everybody told me that, communications were difficult and people just knew their own place. No, these people sent literal emissaries, and on the other side of Europe, to get people that would come there to actually live and fight and die, with some kind of also important representation, right? That impoverished aristocrats we were looking at before was not also just such a poor person after all. And so the same Italians were very much appreciative of the greatness of these knights, how they looked like, what they, what the nobility then they incarnated, without mentioning that initially the source for this mercenarism had been, probably in the 13th century, the same Italian aristocrats. That is to say, we've seen it many times, the rural nobility, along with their retinues and members of defeated, exiled, and dispossessed political factions that at the end of the day had been living in the city as well, have been just exiled, ostracized from there. The same Dante was one of these guys, right? He was expelled from Florence, and we know that he fought as a mercenary in the Contado of Arezzo against the same Florence, for example. There are also impoverished peasants who formed the backbone of the early mercenary armies. For example, the area of Romagna, of Emilia, produces very fine mercenaries. The Montefeltro, from a very early age, dedicate themselves, together with lots of other families. In fact, from the Apennine area, it was more feudal, more aristocratic, more warlike, to, in fact, specialize themselves in warfare, in command of these various retinues that had literally just different levels that at a certain age you had to be able to master, to literally sell their services as reformers of some of the most performing armies of the time, such as, I don't know, the Pisan one. Guido da Montefeltro, for example, was one of these famous commanders who also caused a massacre of French knights in Forlì, was exiled, who fought against the papacy. He lost his son at the Battle of Campaldino that we were talking about recently, the same one Dante participated. Eventually he ended up retiring to a monastery, but this guy basically sets some draconian standards of discipline in the Pisan army. It becomes like essentially the most tactically, the most effectively performing army in Italy during the first half of the 14th century. After which you have the gradual decline of the communal liberty, of the free communes, if you want, because that's when the bigger ones start conquering the others, and this also brings together with the general crisis of the times, of course, to an oligarchization, if not an autocratization of the local lords that had otherwise been sort of, today we would say, democratically elected in these systems, even though there is no democracy here, no democratic estate at all. Thank God, right? This is a fully traditional type of society. But in fact, there is an order, there is established by the lordships, replacing this sort of decadent one, starting, well, it depends. In the late 13th century, we're still at the peak. The peak is not past until the 10s and the 20s of the 14th century. But this is also reached because it was a lot of war. And so greater unity of command required these individual leaders to distinguish themselves. And so further fueling the Condottieri phenomenon. A large number of potential employers, ample wealth to be gained and plundered, and not least a temperate climate and fertile land on which to fight, all attracted fighters from every corner of Europe to the Italian military scene. Right? Moreover, Italy was a regular gathering point for crusader armies and a waypoint for Norman, Imperial, and Angevin expeditions, which often left behind some of their members eager to exploit the available local opportunities. Right? We were talking about it, the other paragraph. Let's say the presence of some of the highest European nobility, as the Counts of Flanders, the Dampierre family, that were simultaneously, for example, Neapolitan vassals of the House of Anjou in southern Italy, and that, for example, when the Flemish revolt, like the war against the French, breaks out in 1302, like go back to Flanders, abandoning that post. But we've seen just recently, I don't know, like the same Catalan company has started from the Sicilian Vespers. There is a great deal of back and forth, especially in the great Angevin wealth system, right, from between France, Provence, the Italian Guelphs, the papacy, the Angevin kingdom of Naples, Greece, where there are also lots of, as you know, Italian colonies. So it's really like a massively urbanized, bureaucratized, populated, wealthy, literate, juridically organized, and again military active place. Consider that Pope John the 22nd in the crusade against Milan at the end of the 10th of the 14th century spent something like more than 1 million florins to besiege the city. I mean, we're talking about sums, ciphers that at this point hardly any other power could even dream to spend. Right? That's why all that banking rising exactly at this point and fueling civilization in the forms of armies, right? Including these mercenary elements within them. Now, by the end of the 13th century, that's how you have organized mercenary companies that had become quite common in Italy, telling the truth pretty much everywhere, but even more so there because of this wealth concentration and the very high level of belligerence, the highest, again, in Europe by both standards, summed together. So you can imagine why. This is the crucial explanation. And this is continuing in the early decades of the 14th century. These mercenaries not only began to be numerically significant, but also extended their existence beyond the limits of a single campaign. This is a very underrated aspect. The actual beginning of what you would conventionally, in this case not so conventionally, draw the line where, say, permanent armies begin in history, which is, again, as a medievalist personally, like a non-question, meaning that there were always permanent forces of some sort from the, the Masnata, the Huscars, etc. But here we're talking about massive amounts that, in fact, like we say, it's mostly mid-14th century France, right? Communes and other sources, we know because we know what, of course, the Italians were doing at the same time, had already been doing this, had already been there with, Villani says, by the 40s of the 14th century, like Milan having 5,000-6,000 men-at-arms, more or less continuously under its control, which we do not know too much actually about this. This is documentarily speaking. I mean, we know because there is a massive historiographical development, but say the archives of Milan specifically went destroyed. Right, so you have these holes, right, in European documentation for which you know very much, say from narrative sources. Some are still, in spite of these losses, the best documented areas in Europe, but not the actual technicalities of the same. This is the moment in which there is the shift between, say, the massive communal army towards something more contained, professional, but still very big in size. And for this reason, like, it must be readily available, right? This massive shock force composed of men-at-arms that, again, are dominating the scene while the large Italian infantries are shrinking because their lords decide that they don't have to fight anymore. They can afford, like, to make them do something else. Like the Condottieri system is very much dependent on this, that great part of the Italian population is invested in particular crafts and industries that are the ones that allow all this wealth to be generated to turn the mercenaries. It's very important. Consider that here also the diversity of Italy, because as far as there is, even in the later phase of regional recompaction, this political division, it's not like an entire country like, say, Switzerland that can literally put together massive armies of thousands of men on the field, even though they're not so big like the ones the Italians brought together before, like during the late communal age. Like, also times have changed also for them, but that's because Switzerland is like a big cooperatively acting country, right? The Italians wouldn't, right? You can't pick so many people from, I don't know, the Milanese or the Venetian hinterland, because that will cause a significant economic loss, that it's not going to be so disastrous at the end of the day, but that still these people are not willing to pay for in order just to also be mobilized. Like, they prefer to have mercenaries, and something at least to an extent, only to an extent, more anachronistic depending on where you see, again, because we will challenge that myth a little bit as well. but they're definitely not a united Italian army. There is some effort, like at the Battle of Fornovo. We will not enter Renaissance warfare today, but we've seen it in the video about the Italian wars, and yet the distrust, the reciprocal distrust and divisions and rivalries between the various Italian states will still bring to the failure of at least the survival of an Italic elite of sort. Now, back to our time, you realize that this mercenary forces initially formed as makeshift coalitions that literally also have this self-awareness, like they elect their own leaders, right? Over time, however, you have the most successful commanders emerging who had a vested interest in continuing these initiatives, and so this is valid for the same Italian armies as well. Initially, there is a lot of coalition warfare, right? And so actually very, say, increasingly inefficient system, because now you have to regulate like an entire stattal army, moving the citizens, the peasants. They start saying, but we do not really want to do it anymore, we're too rich, why should we do it? So that's why they start hiring mercenaries, and more or less always gravitate around. And some of these guys, again, are also self-regulated already. At some point, they also mutiny, they cause unrest problems, but at large, they're very effective and otherwise very reliable. And so this continues on its own, and the various Italian lords at some point pose themselves as veritable protectors of, say, these various mercenaries. For example, during the period of German prevalence, the Ghibelline Vikers, the imperial Vikers of Italy in the north, that are recognized by the emperor, at least by the king of the Romans north of the Alps, act as protectors of the Germans, because they start identifying in the imperial hierarchy during this post-crisis refeudalization, or doing the same, with this higher sense of authority and chivalric order. And these Germans are very attracted to that, because they're paid, they live in this wealthy place, and they are under the leadership of great lords, like, I don't know, the Visconti or the Della Scala. They're very sort of militaristic in inclination. As we said, in the first half of the 14th century, the majority of the combatants and leaders of the companies were German. As far as I'm aware, there is no kind of study ever like showing how this dynamic actually occurred. There were some interesting studies there's one by Seltzer, for example, the Deutsche Söldner in Italiens des Trecentos, that is mostly almost a statistic cut, saying everything that we know about German mercenaries in Italy at the time. And of course, it's a very thorough work. It consults a lot of sources and so on, but unfortunately, and it's not like because we lack research on it specifically, it's rather the fact that there is no actual knowledge of the in-between. Like, we see these Germans in Italy, but we do not know how they came there. Many of them were doing it spontaneously. That much we know. We're talking even about important prominent figures. There are Werner von Omberg, there is Johannes of Saarbrücken. These are, very sort of even relevant, European-wide aristocracy. We've seen the Dampierre, but the Dampierre were a bit more connected to the general international situation, at least. But we see this, individual German princes that do not really have also much of a... They're admittedly a bit like the smaller principalities, but they wouldn't have an immediate reason to be there, at least, other than this seeming revanchism against the Angevins, but opportunities of glory and of riches. This is, again, not very different from the migration era sense of glory and honor of the war band roaming around. And actually, very much more sort of civilized and feudalized situation. Now, we see units from Germany numbering in the hundreds. Right, so they are already like compacting on that basis. Admittedly, this is happening spontaneously at times from bigger contingents like the ones of Henry VII. There is the one that as we've seen, injects probably this large number, not just of Germans, there are also Lorrainese, etc. There had been before, like German mercenaries in southern Italy in the later Swabian era. But when you count this German presence in Italy, the thing becomes shocking. We're talking about altogether at least, and this is just mostly northern Italy and some certain parts of Tuscany, 10,000 men-at-arms. 10,000 men-at-arms. Do you realize what that means? Do you realize that an average army, right, of regional scale had essentially no more than 3,000 men-at-arms? Here we have more than twice that number, just between northern and central Italy. This is insane. This is just the minimum figure. This is totally insane. And they're not taking over. This is the point. Like, calculate how much forces the Italians had to integrate these guys in the system. It's utterly insane, right? This is the great, last expansive phase of the great medieval civilization that, in my opinion, is even way more fascinating than later Middle Ages in European warfare in general. In any case, among these German, because there is a phase that protracts the German presence also into the 50s and the 60s of the 14th century, and then there are other groups that come from other countries. But you have famous names such as Werner von Urslingen, known in Italy as the Duca Guarnieri, because these names were all sort of adapted to the Italian sound. And we are in the 40s. He was the founder of the Great Company, alongside another German, Konrad von Landau, that was known in Italy as the Conte Lando, which is sort of funny even. Then there was other, again, foreigners. You find the former Hospitalier Knight Jean Montreal du Bar, better known as Fra Moreale, in Italy. They are all connected to this greater company that in the 40s ravages central and northern Italy. But basically it's because there is a block of Italians from one side, one from the other, that pushes this against one another. And ultimately this company doesn't do anything. It dissolves and comes back, say its elements come back to wherever they had come from. This is, again, also very interesting, because it seems that these soldiers were often alienated in many ways. If you judge them on the basis of their violence levels, the horrifying crimes perpetrated against the populations were admittedly not less what the Italians did to one another, but there is, yes, a bit of pinch of Germanic barbarism surely connected with this. You realize that these people were mentally alienated from the situation. We know this from different sources about mercenaries in general. For example, there are even trials to some mixed units of Italians, Germans, etc. And you realize, I don't know, there were some guys that had killed, I don't know, somebody out there in that society. You realize that the psychology of these people does not know the difference. That objectively at that time was not that markedly divided. You have to enter a bit more into modern Europe to get that straight. Between civilian and military life, these people were full professionals of war. They did not know any other business, any other craft, and in many ways they also survived. And at the same out of it, and at the same time, there is still a level of chivalric recognition to these individuals that could do these atrocious things, but were also, I don't know, famous Minnesänger. This is the case of Werner von Omberg, that dies at the siege of Genoa in the early 20s of the 14th century. That, realize extreme violence. This is the thing with us, right? The peak of male creativity is also the peak of male violence, and so this is like a complete form of life to some extent in earlier times in civilization. Again, just like the migration here, at this point here, it becomes already squeezed, compressed between very bulky bulwarks, like, I don't know, the massive, for example, city walls of this, Italian metropolises. I'm preparing a video on that as well, because again, that landscape existed and we somehow missed it. Like, it's not just about the house towers within the cities, it's literally the entire city rings as well that were like a masterpiece of engineering. Naturally, it's all about that, but there were castles in the countryside and more. Naturally, you simply couldn't, say, wipe out a single commune or district in any way. Like, that's had been the problem that the Italians had been wrapping their minds around for centuries and centuries. Of course, like, not even the devastating mid-14th century crisis and this furor from different nationalities can really achieve that, right? When you look at the Conte Landau, well, he saw death and destruction across the peninsula, remaining true to his banner, which proclaimed him, quote, an enemy of God, pity, and mercy. Right? Consider this is really a moment of complete perdition. There is the Black Death. The universal authorities of Papacy and Empire have shrunk, and they have temporarily even sent each other back to help one another because of the culmination, in fact, of those wars at the time of the early 14th century between the Guelphs and Ghibellines in Italy. And so there is an apparent subversion of the traditional mores and a world upside down that you can appreciate in the Triumphum Mortis in a completely different psyche that traumatized Europeans, and not only Europeans, seem like to display now at this point, together with these atrocities. Disposable companies, right? This is what now these groups start becoming, because as you understand, they have gradually escaped not much the authority of, again, the local polities, but essentially their pay. Meaning that the best way to get rid of these people was to say, well, I hire you for a while, then I don't pay you anymore, get the hell out of here, or it's going to end badly. And so you send them ravaging somebody else's countryside, or you hire them because you have some qualm with your own, I don't know, dynastic rival in these city-states, and then you let them go. Sometimes they get beaten hard. For example, the Dove companies were mostly the German veterans of the Venetian Florentine army that destroyed the Della Scala regional territory, were crushed by the Milanese army at Parabiago in the snow. Terrible battle. You have Malherbe, the German leader, this man that eventually atones for his sins, and he goes to Turkey to die at the siege of Smyrna, together with some Italian troops, not just the German ones, against the Turks. Right, so it's a very interesting, also international scenario. Like the awareness of these men in the international scene is incredible. Just these guys, I stress it, had not sprang out like mushrooms from the soil. They had come from Germany. They come fight in Italy, and they all come back to Germany. Like, we do not have evidence of this guy simply staying, like enfeoffing themselves. No. This was a very specifically wanted business for which they were able to go fighting abroad there just to come back. And unfortunately, like, the interesting thing as well is that when they come back to Germany, it's not like we know that much, because we don't have documentation about them, what they thought, that we did there. Like, we know more about what they, in interest of evidence, of literary disposal, who they were and what they did when they were in Italy than when they were noblemen in Germany. And this is incredibly interesting. So essentially from the 70s and the 80s, there are various other bands. There are the Bretons, there are the Provence. We will see now also famously there is the White Company of the English veterans of the 100 Years' War after the Treaty of Bretigny. However, from the 70s and the 80s, there is this sort of final re-emergence of Western civilization that does not die out, like after the major crisis. it's a different time. For example, Italy distinguishes itself for the first meaningful introduction of handgunners that from this last decades of the 14th century start constituting a relevant tactical component, like 1/3 of the entire infantry, which is quite interesting in this. But especially Italians also began to serve as mercenary proper, right? I think one of the very first videos on Schwerpunkt was on Francesco Gonzaga of Mantua. That is, here we are a bit slightly later, but he is like the first lord that becomes also a mercenary, right? Which is like telling you the extent by which the condotta had institutionalized for people that were essentially head of city-states or princely states that become like condottieri themselves in the service of some bigger power, like the ones that had been coalescing at this point. So Italians also began to serve as mercenaries in a consistent fashion. In fact, from this last decades of the 14th century, the starkest evidence in here is that with the regrowth, you have more Italians who come back fighting, and the condottas become virtually entirely Italian from their own. You have foreigners coming and going. There are probably noblemen, princes doing things internationally around, so they're not technically like the soldiers of fortune like of before. But this is what Western Europeans are doing. They start nationalizing on a regional basis, and they start creating more permanent armies with local subjects, right? And so this applies to Italy as well. That's when the same Italians start forming small autonomous companies. Again, they had never disappeared, but there is this gap in the mid-14th century by which it was mostly the foreigners that did that. That's again the desperates, while the gentrified were sheltering themselves during the crisis. It's sort of a psychological dynamic rather than just like strictly military one. Now, among these first Italian companies, we find members of the, again, I can't stress enough, there were already Italian condottas in the 13th century. Then this gap, and then in the late 14th you have, for example, members of the Visconti family from Milan, and the Ordelaffi family from Forlì. Now, bear in mind that, of course, at the head of those foreign companies, there had been these guys. For example, I don't know, the Visconti sent one of their sons at the Battle of Altopascio in 1325 to support Castruccio against the Florentines. And this guy goes with his Germans, and on the way back to Lombardy, crosses the Apennines and fights against the Bolognese at the siege, at the Battle of Zappolino. That is fought like in this Ghibelline coalition of the La Scala, the Este, and in fact the Milanese against this black wealth power. So you can argue that especially the great leaders, the great lords, had always been especially been characterized as the finest cavalry of these households of major princely states like Milan, or this other Ghibelline, especially seigneuries that were a bit more warlike and knightly and feudally co-opted by the empire. Like, there is a sense that the heads of states also have their own picked troops, but the rank and file men at arms had been foreigner. Now these guys instead are Italian. Such formations inevitably combined, of course, different motivations. Like, there's a political background. There's, of course, the most important. There is the one of social promotion that you can understand. The Sforza, for example, emerged, as you know, from like very humble background. They were farmers, and they sort of joined like this war. This is quite interesting because you do not find it so frequently in other parts, especially feudal Europe. Right, in the 11th century, you can hope like to be a peasant, maybe stealing a sword or grabbing it from a corpse, and I don't know, knowing incidentally how to go on horseback, learning the craft by someone, and becoming even a milis in the retinue of some powerful lord or even monarch, and making fortune. We've seen it, for example, with the Familia Regis of Henry I of England. Like, there are these instances. And there, it's actually also a much more sort of aristocratic reality. Indeed, Italy had already been a bit like this before, but now it sort of comes back even more. The greater mover, in fact, of the local warfare had always been this ancient rivalries and distrust between the various houses that ruled the various city-states, right? That are also the bulk of the local native elite cavalry, because they really live in that sort of oligarchic and patrician fashion. There were sort of regional divides, as you understand as well. For a Florentine of the time, say a Milanese or a German, were equally foreigners, of course, like to different extent. The point is that the German, at least, would sooner or later return to his own home without involving himself in the politics of his city, whereas the Milanese were always looming, trying to infiltrate in Tuscany at this point across the Apennine. So there are some different military cultures as well that develop on the basis of this. Milan, for example, is sort of the most militaristic power, the one that develops the state more in that function, and actually also in a more effective way. The Florentines instead are a bit more for the libertas and sort of a republican mentality of bankers that do not want to spend too much for war, but especially do not want to risk some sort of armed insurrection amongst this more egalitarianly balanced system. You have all the reasons why things turn out the way they do, also in the broader Italian balance of the time. During this period, contracts between mercenary companies and their employers were called condotte. And that we explain, like it literally comes from the term to lead, to conduce, right? That's the thing. The contractors providing military services thus were known as condottieri, so those who lead, those who bring this retinue fundamentally. That they began, of course, to ever more privately organize into larger formations. That had always been the case. Remember that the early companies, the early condottas, are exactly like those forces that a small nobleman could mobilize and search for fortune abroad, right? It's not just like, I don't know, in the 11th century it would have been smaller groups, right? Even maybe some single errant guys in a very romantic, ideal sense. But of course, by the 13th century already, again, condottas of 50, 70 men-at-arms were pretty large in that sense, but they started appearing. And they had a progressed internal organization. That's why you hired them. You didn't have to compose them. No, these were already professionals of war, and that's why you hired them. They were elite, right? They were the men-at-arms, the shock element, the decisive arm, right, in the Italian armies. Initially, the duration of the condotta contract was very brief. As we observed, it was also kind of useless just to keep these guys up for long. Sometimes they passed by, they had to reach some other place, they incidentally served this local city. This happened very often, even with random officials of other authorities, right? There are some Angevins, for example, that are crossing, they're Provençals, reaching the Kingdom of Naples. They pass through Tuscany, and the Florentines are fighting against the Aretines, and that's how they are put at the head. So the Florentine command, a joint Florentine command, at the Battle of Campaldino, 1289. And they are also celebrated for having been these heroes, because also the Italians were again sensitive to this foreign chivalric ethos, and I don't know, the local literates were very much into French literature. And so there is an idea that those guys come from the lands in which feudalism is the strongest, which chivalric epos is sort of more informing than even the local nobility. So it's not that, again, local Italian men-at-arms have much to envy to these guys. In fact, we know that they were pretty much the same. But socially speaking, they're a bit better put, like at the top of the city-states for, involving themselves too much, right? And they did not live in that sort of feudally obedient fashion that required those the higher lords, monarchs, etc., to go here and there, because the Italians again were largely not under a monarch themselves. The Italian city-states sought additional protection or an increase in their offensive power only for as long as strictly necessary. Remember that the Italian communal army at this point is entrusted to a podestà that was mostly a foreign guy, in the sense that it was actually another Italian that, however, came from another faraway city that, again, in theory, should have not mingled into the local politics. But this turned out to be families of professional commanders that passed the craft like from generation to serve a city or another, right? And then you have the great lord. They're a bit like proto-lords. Then some proper lords affirm themselves. Again, the La Scalas are very warlike. Can grant at some point, I think, charges something like, I don't know, to 1 to 20, like, and even makes it out. Right? This level of sort of heroism, of chivalric culture. Now, but aside from this, the Italian city-states sought additional protection or an increase in their offensive power only for as long as strictly necessary. Which is obvious. This is valid also for other powers. A season, which is also longer than what the old feudal service, in fact, had managed to be reduced to by the same nobility. Sometimes the condotta could serve only for a few weeks. Again, this is particularly the case at the beginning of the period when you have this 30 city-states, and so there is sort of less need for more intensive campaigns that required much larger organization, because if anything, armies were of regional capacity were fruit of leagues, of associations, and there were enough, again, militarized Italian condottieri to just command everything, right? This of course, did not help to solidify the initial bond between the city and the condottieri. This was also a strategy in later time to avoid, in fact, these people to become maybe too cupid of the city's wealth and to keep them away, just serving for a while and then out. And in fact, at the contract expiration, and sometimes even in the midst of a campaign, the condottiero had no qualms about offering his services to the enemies of his previous employer. This is the case also of John Oakwood, that, as you know, has this magnificent thank to him by the Florentines, but had fought against them at some point as well. But it was somehow normal, considering that the average factionalism also existing within the city-state and the various leagues, different parties across the country. So it could mean less than we think. It was not a monolithic city policy at all, and that's why also these condottieri have such great opportunities of employment. Now, another danger that could not be underestimated was the end of hostilities. The company would need to vacate, but it was nearly impossible to compel them to do so. At least in a direct way. It was not uncommon for the city to fall victim at times to extortion as former protectors transform into oppressors. This happened with Lucca, for example, that is exhausted by the successful exploit against Florence, however, that basically is taken hostage by the Cerullo company. The name is after a nearby hill where the German mercenaries had encamped, and so basically ransomed Lucca to the highest bidder. But because they knew that, of course, there were other powers that simply could pay for that without even needing to go there, right? Finding it out or whatever. In that case, they actually kidnapped a member of the Visconti family as well, and they elect him as their leader. at the same time. So you understand here, I'm just bringing up anecdotes. Of course, you must understand why these things were specifically happening in the context, because the anecdote does not stop there. That's why I need an entire series of hundreds of videos on 14th and 15th century Italy to properly explain this. But just know that these are very well documented instances, and that you should somehow learn about them if you have any sort of military culture in the period. Now, during the breaks between contracts and the long winter months, the companies of fortune often turned into bands dedicated to banditry, perhaps even in the territories of their previous employers, as we've seen, in a shifting balance of legality and illegality that became a distinctive characteristic of this phase of warfare in Italy. We are especially in the mid-14th century. Faced with threats, Italian cities sometimes managed to set aside their rivalries and unite their forces against common enemies. For instance, the aforementioned great company of the Duke Werner von Urslingen was driven out of the territories of Florence, Siena, Perugia, and Bologna that had associated themselves. They actually always done actually with the Guelph League of Tuscany, to which also the Emilian Bologna participated. Because you understand, this had already been a mechanism, and after all, this company did not really create many problems to the places. It was really just like you don't know where they would have fallen at some point, but in fact they fell nowhere. They were later disbanded and expelled after some lords tried to hegemonize. The same Bolognese Pepoli tried to hegemonize the company, and then it got disbanded after having been conflictual with them. So it's really all depending on the other blocks of cities that are fueling on the embers of this potentially explosive situation, rather than really the military force per se actually being able to do what? To take over one of these cities? Not really. A special parenthesis is deserved by the White Company of John Oakwood. I've also never talked about him. We neither really talked too much about the 100 Years' War, because in many ways, yes, it's sort of most the evergreen of late medieval warfare, but it's not exclusive like in size. Like what happens in other countries like Italy, Spain, Germany is in many ways as relevant, right? So it's important to know the whole picture rather. But there is something about John Oakwood that is objectively extraordinary. It's not like, again, like these figures are not overly emphasized sometimes, just like, I don't know, the myth of the longbow. Remember that the Italians at this point produced longbows in Lombardy to export in England, but they did not use the longbow. They used the crossbow. Right? So, how relevant do you think that the difference really was? Or even in this case, why did they stick to the crossbows as also one of the most advanced military cultures of the time? But let's get into it, because the necessity of having more reliable military forces became even more pressing in the second half of the 14th century, as we've seen with this process of territorial recompaction. In fact, the distinctions between the defeated and the victors in the previous wars became sharply defined. The smaller communes had succumbed, or even simply the weaker ones had succumbed, depending really on how they were ruled. And certain major centers began to assert themselves on others, conquering increasingly vast territories that needed to be adequately garrisoned. And so, as you know, throughout all the rest of, of medieval history at least, Milan, Venice, and Florence emerged as Italian continental powers, while in other smaller cities, the signoria, that is to say, the lordship, the signory, sought to protect its independence by adopting a distinctly military character in giving rise to generations of condottieri. So serving these bigger powers, as we said before, with Francesco Gonzaga, but this is exemplified also by, I don't know, the Malatesta of Rimini, who produced dozens of skilled warriors. Again, the Romagnol area is always very tumultuous, is not particularly developed, it's somehow fragmented, but it still produces, for this reason, pretty good men-at-arms. During the same period, the popes in Avignon were investing substantial resources to restore order in their original domains. Think about the efforts of Egidio Bornas that we have seen in action, also the Archbishop of Toledo, the Battle of Rio Salado against the Moors. Well, he sent as a cardinal legate to Italy, to central Italy, to the Papal States, to put together like the situation. Of course, most of this depended on how many men-at-arms you had. Right? It was a very interesting survey that the Avignon papacy was making for the central Italian lands, and they interrogated a priest in the Marches area, like in central Italy on the Adriatic. And this humble priest says, I think that 500 men-at-arms to subjugate the Mark are enough. Just to quantify, like, you know, how do you fix problems with mercenaries, right? And another event that would profoundly influence the future developments in the Condotta was, in fact, the arrival in Italy in 1362 of John Hawkwood, better known in Italian as Giovanni Acuto, which was, again, it's not the translation, it's more like a phonetic transfer, like inventing the name. Acuto means sharp, right? It has nothing to do with Hawkwood, if anything, because it just sounds the same. That's literally how they called him like that, as we've seen also with other foreigners. So this white company, again, was the product of the Treaty of Bretigny. It was a period of truce during the 100 Years' War between France and England that had left these, in this case, mostly English veterans, involved in that conflict without employment now. So at the age of 42, what you want to consider, meaning that, yes, I mean, people normally lived less, and of course, like, we understand that many of them were just for this massive shot at a certain age, and they lived less also because what they did through these times was so excruciating. But think how, say, motivation worked for these people. What do? You survive the war, you go fight again somewhere else, right, across Europe. And so at this age, John Hawkwood responded to an invitation from John II Palaiologus, the Marquis of Montferrat. This was this interesting branch of essentially Byzantine Piedmontese rulers that called, in this case, this English mercenary and his men. So just be aware of how, in fact, aware these people were of one another across the Alps and beyond, to be engaged, in this case, against Amadeus VI of Savoy, known as the Green Count. You know, there's some sort of mythology that eventually intertwines with the Italian, symbolism of the green, the red, the white count. This was the era of Piedmont that was contended between this rising Savoy and various smaller dynasties, especially in the southwest, and then you had Milan in the east and Montferrat south of that. So it's a pretty bloody area, especially since the mid 14th century. And this is what simply brings Hawkwood probably to go to Italy. He maybe had an idea prior to that, but it's just like a specific opportunity that arose because he was called and offered this job. That's literally how it works. The success in this endeavor was spectacular because the same Amadeus VI of Savoy, Count of Savoy was captured. Like the Count of Savoy, we made a video about Savoy, was like a hell of a prince of the Holy Roman Empire. This guy gets captured. He's extremely expansive, and in fact, what happens is that not just Amadeus is forced to return the previously conquered territories to John Palaiologos, but he's obliged to pay a hefty ransom, to say the least, to be liberated, right? And this feat made the English condottiero famous and highly sought after throughout Italy, as he demonstrated his skill not only through victories but also in defeats, always managing to save his armies from destruction. By the way, if you are wondering, because sometimes I see around YouTube strange terminologies, condotta is the contract, singular. Condotta is with E, right? Condotte is plural. The term for this condotta leaders is singular, either condottiero or condottiere, right? There are other terms telling the truth that derive, as you understand, also from, the relative Latin formula. It's not so straightforward. Like condottiere is mostly like a historiographical term that comes in. Condottieri with the I is plural, right? So people you can, I don't know, when they write video titles or videos entirely, you can just make a simple search of how to pronounce a word without embarrassing yourself. Now, in any case, John Hawkwood's services to the Republic of Florence are the most famous, as also the more particularly valuable, as at the end of the 14th century, the major Tuscan power that aspired, in fact, to some level of regional hegemony, but was a bit more, again, gentrified compared to more aggressive powers, faced threats to its very independence for the first time in a more concrete sense from the Visconti of Milan, that had become de facto, like since the 14th century, the beginning of the 14th century, like the greater competitor of Florence. We will see now what the Milanese were doing, that is to say, trying to hegemonize the entire central northern Italy, and they were just a step away from doing so. Later, the Venetians almost made it. I made a video about the Battle of the Molinella, that actually is one of those condottieri battles, also a massive one at the time, also by European standard size, that prevented Venice in that case from taking over, like also the peninsula. Now, Florence, saved by John Hawkwood and his White Company, named for their polished steel armor. We've seen it as a terminology used by the same Milanese armor, as a matter of fact, for how well polished it was, expressed its gratitude by showering him with gold and commemorating him with the famous fresco by Paolo Uccello, one of the greatest artists as far as properly the representation, probably of the beauty of the condottieri, like the martial aesthetics of these men of war. And the same Italian condottieri were grateful to John Hawkwood, viewing him as a model of tactical expertise to emulate and refine. We'll talk about the battles of John Hawkwood more in detail. However, bear in mind that there is no actual evidence that any major change was really occurring there in a strictly technical or tactical sense, because there are people, again, that think this guy was English, and the English of the 100 Years' War fought in a different way from the rest of... This is not really true, right? The reason why definitely John Hawkwood and the White Company were the best condottieri of that generation was their mode of organization. That is to say, a very unitary one, that depended largely also on John Hawkwood and his personal abilities, but did have a lot to do, yes, with their English background, but not in the sense you would technically imagine, but rather with the way this business worked, like the indenture system, the very strong control that the English monarchy had on those units, the way they had in fact held themselves during the same war. And so an organization efficiency that worked very well in Italy, and where the effectiveness of these Englishmen came from. Not because they fought in any particular way better. By the way, they were also defeated at some point by the Italians. But this is not important. Important is that there is a model, a business model, that is essentially informed by the various European experiences in warfare being shared, and this broader Western system sort of rewiring further to establish, in fact, ever more punching forces. The Italian city-states confirmed the effectiveness of a system based on contracts of condotta established with experienced military leaders who were rendered trustworthy through longer-lasting ties and fair remuneration. A guaranteed salary instead of precarious plunder, along with a more loyal relationship, given now the enhanced possibilities, the coming back of the probably of European politics after the crisis, like the compaction of the Italian regional states, fostered the growth of this new generation of Italian condottieri. We remember them like Alberico da Barbiano, the Dal Verme family, Facino Cane, for example, among the various ones, establishing a semi-permanent connection in the latter list of condottieri, specifically with Gian Galeazzo Visconti of Milan, the most ambitious and powerful lord in Italy by the end of the 14th century. Under Gian Galeazzo, Milan basically reaches the greatest stretch of power and territorial extent properly that would have eventually been checked would have been prevented by the expansion of Venice, that literally decided, as we will see now, to create a terra firma state to block Milan, and actually becoming, as we were saying, the attemptively hegemonic state in central northern Italy, by coming pretty close territorially to the same Ambrosian city. There were now, of course, opportunities for these condottieri to foster some sort of greater military culture, some greater unity of command, given this permanency, this the compaction of the greater polities in the necessity of, in fact, more permanent forces. There are schools of condottieri. John Oakwood, for example, stands out in a phase that will step further, for example, with we will see now these Forseschi and Bracceschi that were, even in this case, not really real schools of war. They were just two terms used to define two different modes of war that would have allegedly been attributed to Muzio Attendolo Sforza and Braccio da Montone, hence the name, but that, we repeat just because, I don't know, maybe there was an Italian humanist that said, oh, look at these guys, there were these two clans, but we do not even have like the evidence of this doctrine having been the major deal. Like, you can parrot that and say, well, just showing off that that these things existed, but studying the art of war of those times is very different, right? Also, historiography changes to an extent that is not so easy, paradox. You would think the more you go ahead in time, the easier it is to reconstruct these battles. Yes, but there are also significant ups and downs. For example, humanism emerging from the crisis makes the scholars writing from, I don't know, a tower with all their comfort, like being paid by some lord that is the actual guy who goes at war, but these guys do not see war, like to the extent, I don't know, the Italian historians did at the beginning of the 14th centuries, because they were also the guys who fought in the armies where there was civic liberty. They participated to the councils. There were magistrates of the commune. In fact, the Condottieri battles are a bit more of a mystery than it's normally realized, and people tend to historiographically focus mostly on archive sources to mostly look at the organization of these armies, but now it's complicated to explain what that can be dangerous because they're still dispositive forces, sources, and if you want to reconstruct the battles and how the art of war worked at the time, you have to do some extra homework, really, that is through narrative sources. Still, there's no other way around. So paradoxically, you have, excuse me, some figures like Mallet, who popularized the Italian condottieri in sort of a relatively late historiography, and everybody cites him. This is a guy that, people bother me because I don't put sources out here. This is a guy who wrote an entire book that, yes, has a bibliography at the end, but that does not source the statements that he makes in the book. And historians do this too often, and don't think that we know about this. It's not like you read Mallet, you understand the condottieri. That's just a sum up, like from some sort of, Anglosphere perspective of what this world picture is, but without too much analysis or without too much precision or without too much further insight, other than the one you could grasp from sort of just reading the chronicles of the time. And so actually being specialized in the art of war is something very, very, very different. I haven't talked so much about the condottieri, but I want to actually go deep into the topic because, for example, I have another battle, I will not say which one is coming up preparing, we must popularize this, but we must also analyze. This is what I do, especially in the battle videos, because I pick all the sources and sort of reconstruct originally the whole thing. Now, aside from this, driven by the example of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, or by his threats, right? So this Milanese expansion that literally penetrated up to Umbria, Tuscany, surrounding Florence. It was, again, a very complicated thing. Technically, the cities were subjecting themselves to this Lord of Milan that, however, exactly in the fringe, was so distant that did not bring to any actual oppression. It was just a way to make these cities escape the hegemony of the rivals of Milan, like Florence and Venice. And then dynastic crises and this power shrinks again. The cities change regime, and so this Milanese blob shrinks as well. So it's, even though, again, there is a Lombard court which is pretty strong and sound, it can do this like others can't. There is this permanent threat is very real. And so the cities of Florence and Venice had to find solutions commensurate with this Visconti danger they faced. This had started from a long time. And so there are some news from Venice regarding military organization that will make the Venetian power, in fact, the best organized militarily wise, bringing the Venetian Condotta to be the greatest, the most advanced army, together with the ordinances of Charles the Bold for Burgundy. And I have people coming on, because I made a video years ago on the Venetian army organization between the 14th and 15th century, and say, I didn't know that Venice had this army. And my point is, why do you even? I appreciate the honesty, but the question is, are you really saying that you studied medieval warfare and you did not know this? If you do not know this, the question is, what do you actually know, or where do you actually get your information from? And the answer, in my opinion, is always the internet, but the bad one, and mostly this weird culture that creates some silly stereotypes of some sort, but never focuses on the actual objectivity or accuracy of the historical narrative. like if you need to discover in that Venice had also a hell of a land army in the 15th century of that scale and standards. Sorry to say that, but you're not in a very good place in terms of military historical literacy. Now, this Venetian response was destined definitely to serve as a model. The Serenissima had a long history of maintaining permanent garrisons of men and galleys in her trading posts in the Eastern Mediterranean. All right, we'll have to come back on Venetian history as far as the city of Venice history, because we're making Florence now in the historical original series. It will take a while to complete. There are other cities that are very important as well, but Venice, of course, is so crucial in many ways. More than else, Venice had a very strong political control, had arguably the best, most unitary statal government as far as especially the internal control of the city, like in a senatorial fashion, could go, right? And they were incredibly attentive to their financial policies. We've seen it in fact in the video about the navy as well. That was the heart of it all, and that cost a lot. And so there are very interesting parallels to draw also between the land and the sea forces here. Because, by the way, the arch enemies Genoa and Florence had ideally joined forces. Not just, I don't know, the Italian wars would have not happened. Nobody would have had the capacity to invade the peninsula. But the sheer amount of, say, the vastity of wealth that was burned by the wars between Venice and Genoa would have been alone, if you read the scale of that, it's utterly insane, right? It would have basically boosted the same, Italian civilizational development to a degree that even in terms of land armies could have, I don't know what, united the peninsula or something. This, of course, could not be done because what Venice and Genoa were fighting over was the control of the same Mediterranean. They didn't want to share that. They want to have everything for themselves. And so, naturally, it wasn't just about Genoa and Venice. I don't think, strangely, people do is consider the Italian city-state only when they're maritime republics. I mean, Milan and Florence were literally the most important ones together with Venice, and were, of course, major continental expressions, say, respectively, Lombard and Tuscan power. But never mind those armies. Those do not exist because you don't find it on the war games books, right? Because Heath was too lazy to open a book immediately. But the sense, of course, is that Venice has a hostility, at least a very strong preconception against creating a land force, because they don't care. They just want to dominate the seas, occupying ports, not being dislodged because they are the only true naval force out there together with Genoa. In any case, if you besiege a port from the sea without naval forces that just the Italians have, in that de facto also permanent fashion, these are the largest naval powers in the year. You cannot besiege because the enemy can be resupplied constantly. So aside from, of course, the forces involved, you can't dislodge them. That's how the Italians create this racket all across the Mediterranean. But on top of, a massive financial wealth and also the same internal market of Italy, it's not just a merely predatory thing. We talked widely about this, the Italian arts and crafts and the local industries, and again, the fertility of the land, the population, etc. But the Milanese expansionism brings the Venetians to accept the idea that they must establish a terra firma state to block Milan, because Milan at this point has the capacity of attacking Venice from land with such a force that can't tackle Venetian influence on the rest of the peninsula. Naturally, it's a very difficult topic now to digress on it. So somehow useless. Venice had all some avamposts in southern Italy, did not want anyone to close the Otranto Strait. So it's, again, what these Italians are doing here is extremely complicated. We don't have the time to digress on it. There is a first time that is after the aforementioned war against the Della Scala that Venice and Florence do in the 30s of the 14th century, that had been fought over also the control of some salt mines close to the lagoons that the Veronese wanted to control. In Venice, it was an open affront, and so you see this early also Scaliger power that had threatened Venice in the same way. So what the Venetians do is they leave an avampost on land there. It's not aimed at creating a broader territory, but it's the first terra firma possession that they truly have, not just a port, but some sort of inland power. However, in the early decades of the 15th century, Venice is obliged now by the Milanese expansion to expand herself on the mainland, right? And they succeed in an unprecedented way. Consider that there was no precedent to that. They expand in similar ways to the other regional states, but there had been probably no past of Venice in that direction, without mentioning that Venice did not technically belong to the Holy Roman Empire, so the lands they occupy in the Italic kingdom are not their own. This will be an issue with the Habsburgs until the beginning of the 16th century. We don't have the time to see. Vicenza, Verona, and Padua were the first cities to be absorbed by Venice. Then you have the Friuli region that I made a video on. Then Brescia and Bergamo in the same Lombardy, so just one step away from Milan, like a few tenths of kilometers from Milan, which is incredibly threatening. This tells you how the Milanese are caught off guard. Again, there is a sort of frontier in between of these other cities that had never been permanently, directly controlled with iron fist, that had always been playing their cards. Mantua, for example, with Gonzaga, becomes really this wedge between Milan and Venice. It is so crucial, and it develops for this reason some militaristic tendencies, very good war horses. Ferrara, also this close, is appreciated for firearms, because at this point, especially like the center of Italian gunnery that is ever more needed as for artillery parks by the most updated, by every updated, at least, European prints. Such rapid Venetian conquests made it urgent to maintain a military force superior to that, of course, of her belligerent neighbors, including the same powerful Milan, on the basis of which the entire expansion had been already calibrated. The solution was a careful search for competent condottieri and the gradual extension to contract lengths, first to 1 year and then to 2 or 3, paired with the allocation of fiefs and privileges as rewards for captains who signed the contracts. This is relevant because, as you understand, it's a sort of feudalism, except it's much more malleable and, generally speaking, very attentive towards the local autonomies, which was also a way to counter Milan, because if you acted in a more liberal way, the cities would have followed you more easily. Naturally, there is a lot of back and forth. It's a fierce struggle. Some of the most important battles of the era are fought in the Po Valley and the surroundings because of this major clash. The efficient Venetian administrative system took care, as we've seen on the rest, ensuring oversight and services for the companies and maintaining regular payment for the soldiers. This was new because, again, the condotte had been mostly, again, contracted ad hoc and just released, or maintaining, a position being built at somewhere, but not having this full sort of institutionalization within the Venetian terra firma and under senatorial control. The armies of Venice not only became a threat to any adversary, but eventually resembled modern standing armies, because they were so big and so well supplied that this was really like ahead for the time. The Venetian example was emulated throughout Europe. These are the same years in which Philip the Communes, that knew something about warfare in Europe said basically the French copied the ordnance companies from the Italian lords. Of course, this the same Venetian condotta was imitated by large states, right, with some adaptations, of course, especially in these ones, because they remain substantially feudal, right? But the same concept behind the same Burgundian ordinances, it's similar, right? And in part, today we will not talk so much about the Condottieri army's organic, but there was a big deal of, as you know, complexity in the way the lances, subunits were being organized. Nevertheless, a small nobility was now dedicated to arms in a way that could be, again, framed as if they had been mercenaries. That's what I was talking about in other videos. They are the same people who had impoverished themselves and now find a place in more permanent forces of their same land or abroad, by the way. There are some Italians being hired, for example, in the same Burgundian ordinances, together with Englishmen, Germans, just Frenchmen. So you have the Flemish bit less than the truth, just the gun part in general. But this is interesting because in Italy, commanders were often chosen from beyond the internal borders, at least, to avert political interference. The most renowned condottieri of the first half of the 15th century rarely served under their own banners as a consequence. Those were not free companies anymore. They were fighting under probably an overlord. The Dal Verme family, Carmagnola, Muzio Tendolo Sforza, Braccio da Montone, Niccolò Piccinino, Tartaglia, and the Gattamelata were all engaged in territories and cities far from their personal interests. The system worked. Tendolo and Braccio da Montone distinguished themselves as brilliant innovators, at least to a degree, of military art, shared more or less by the condottieri throughout Italy and also other parts of Europe. And only Carmagnola was famously executed for suspected treason, while Francesco Sforza, son of Tendolo, was the only one to seize power in the city he had served, Milan, and also because their system was very sort of compact. Like, this guy was at the head of essentially the Milanese forces, and as such, like, you could think of a coup, but not as an external entity, as we've seen, like, I don't know, in the previous century, right? This is very important because there had been attempts of that kind, but they failed as well. Also in Milan, the Germans at some point tried to overthrow the Visconti, but they go nowhere. There are the papal forces that are about to attack Milan, and they realize that there is a job for them, and that the papacy would replace them with French provincial mercenaries. So they recall the Visconti, and that's the only time which anything even there goes wrong really with the Germans in a threatening sense to sort of the broader statal authority. Now, the fame gained by the Italian condottieri was overshadowed only at the end of the 15th century by the rising star of the Swiss mercenaries, with their relentless pikes that began to kill, as you know, literally entire armies of the same kind, like, I don't know, in fact, the same Burgundian ones of Charles the Bold, who fell victim of the same Helvetic forces. What is important to stress is that the same Swiss had evolved their art of war as a consequence of their defeat at the Battle of Arbedo against the forces of Carmagnola, the Milanese commander. This is extremely important to remember because it's when essentially this Swiss infantry, there was just infantry, just like later, but still had a prevalence of halberds, and essentially they are defeated by the Milanese, the Milanese men-at-arms, the lances, that dismount, and with lances that are longer than the same Swiss halberds, destroy the Swiss. Of course, not just because of the weapons, but still after that, the Swiss withdrawing their away from indiscreet eyes in their Swiss valleys, and decide to doctrinally extend like the pikes to that greater to the majority of the troops, which entail a completely different organization, much greater collective training, and that's where the Swiss essentially come up. Eventually they would, as you know, march on Milan as well, but also in a very different situation where, you know, the hell had broken loose internationally during the Italian wars, and so it's a very particular situation. And so when you look at the contribution made by the Italians to the renewal of military art and the birth of modern armies, see, Venice continues, right, as an independent country, for example, it has a fine army throughout this period. So you realize this is one of the most significant military innovations of the era, and that this sense that the Condottieri paid eventually also during the Italian wars because of some alleged sort of backwardness or incapacity or anachronism, or even worse like this, the idea that it would have been allegedly sort of avoiding the same fight or death. This is something that Machiavelli said, right? But that eventually entered a bit in the common vulgata, and that this is definitely not the case. And we will partly see this because I want to look at some specific aspects of the Condottieri for this video, and then we'll talk about them sometime else. First of all, a bit like the organic side of the story. So the basic unit of a free company was referred to normally as a lanx or barbuta, that was a type of helmet, or corazza, which means cuirass. And this actually all corresponds to different times, and we do not even know specifically when one, let's say, where did one come from exactly. The barbuta were the first ones, then the lanx arrives in the second half of the 14th century, but the term existed. It could have referred to, say, a specific organization, say, of the White Company, that maybe was imitated, but it's mostly like a bit of a mythology, and we'll have to go a bit into the depths of the sources to understand. But all these terms referred to, in fact, that's why it's useless also to focus too much on this, on the corps constituted by a heavily armored knight, the man-at-arm, right? The lanx consisted typically, which is the best, the most famous form of organization, because if anything, like you had the men-at-arm and then this other retinues that would be arrayed during the battle, like in homogeneous troops units. And so again, I don't have to digress too much on this now, it's for other videos, but you know how the system really worked. There were the broken lances, there were the guys who had remained without an employer, and that would be, for example, settled down as some sort of semi-permanent forces by, say, the Venetians, as we've seen. And so anecdotes, not anecdotes, we'll have to see this all in depth better somewhere else. The lanx, however, on average, we're approximating here for the era, consisted of a knight and his entourage, which included a mounted sergeant, a page, and 2 or 3 archers, crossbowmen or infantry armed in various ways. Never underestimate this aspect in the broader art of war. It's not from this info that you will simply get how armies really were. And so that's why also archive sources are not as important as the narrative ones, and the diachronic and comparative study of the art of war. In fact, the lanx could be also larger, or conversely, comprised of even just 2 elements, the knight and an accompanying attendant. It really depended on, even just for how poor, you know, say, in dire straits these troops were. They were on campaign, etc. The captain would gather several hundred lances. Here we're talking mostly in the 15th century, say, the more advanced time, either individually or organized by other lesser captains who formed smaller groups that could have been agglutinated spontaneously. Remember, this is a private business still, and also when the Venetian Condotta settles people down, it's because there are free companies still in theory. Based on the number of armed men the captain was able to assemble, to negotiate a detailed contract with the patron. The knights, with their own retinue, could make agreements directly without the mediation of a captain as well. This was the case with the so-called broken lances, as we've said before, which were gathered into specific companies and placed under the command of a captain chosen by the city in that circumstance. Again, I'm hyper-synthetic here. We will see these things again much better. If you're interested in the Venetian army organization, I already made a video on that. Machiavelli was the enemy of the Condottieri, and that's why we have to talk about him. Because, he's such a great thinker, and he changed the world thought. His Art of War, The Prince, are some of the greatest masterpieces in military literature. But of course the guy was very ideal, was a bureaucrat to a degree, and was also very faithful to the ideals of ancient Rome to an extent that made him blind to the actual reality of Italian warfare at the time, to which he did not really have much of a power, if not mostly smearing the Condottieri at still centuries of distance. In fact, the great humanist found it immoral to fight for money. Now, the Italian humanists of the 16th century in particular deplored the use of mercenaries and believed that states should develop their military potential with their own militias. And the reason, of course, was the Italian wars, where, of course, the Italian states had been overrun by the larger national forces of Spain, of France, of the empire, that were at least more cohesive in a political and regional sense. They could sort of strategically affect much the entire Italian balance that now was wholly unbalanced. Now, the example to follow, thus, for such idealists was that of ancient Rome with her legions, right? Simple citizens who fought loyally for the ideal of the common good, which was not entirely also how things worked in an absolute sense, was understood in the later Middle Ages or the Renaissance. In any case, the most vehement accusations came from the prince, in which Machiavelli described the mercenary troops as, quote, disunited, ambitious, and undisciplined, untrustworthy, valiant among friends, and cowardly among enemies. And Machiavelli makes all his rant that we're aware of. He reiterated these accusations also in the discourses on the first decade of Livy, and on various other occasions, right? And there are some interesting studies on this you can find online, JSTOR or Academia Ida, but I'm interested in the strictly military side of the story. In order to support his arguments, Machiavelli, for example, even went so far as to falsify, famously, the number of deaths in battles among the Condottieri. We were talking also battles that were, pretty distant in time, but just saying, okay, these guys did not shed blood with one another. We know instead that the battles among the Condottieri were very bloody, right? There was actually nothing particularly wrong about the system at all. Actually, again, it was very advanced. In fact, Machiavelli's own warnings went unheeded in the Florentine world time, saying Italy, the best troops of the time were definitely the fearsome yet mercenary Swiss, whom princes competed for at great expense and who proved impossible to replace with citizen militias, at least, because you should understand also what Machiavelli was envisaging, not some sort of professional troops. And so what did the Romans do at the peak of their power? he envisaged some, not even, and this is where the gentrification kicks in, because he didn't even mean that there had to be Florentine citizens to go at war. No, it was the Florentine peasants. So they didn't, it's this ideal mentality by which it's not even much inspired by Rome, in my opinion, by Greece to an extent. To the extent, of course, there were, other people in, other humanists were also Condottieri, as we would say now, in Italy, that thought very differently, including, I don't know, Julius II, the same warrior pope or things like this. But we are on a thin boundary between medieval and Renaissance warfare. I would like to stick to the Middle Ages, but of course we must refer partially to some Renaissance example. Now, I will spend an extra word of praise towards the Milanese armor, which is, broadly speaking, also Lombard and Italian, telling the truth. I made a video recently on these unparalleled arms, because while Italian Condottieri were setting standards, military standards across Europe, Milan was historically forging, for quite a while by the way, the most beautiful weapons in the world. Right? A warrior holds little value without arms worth of his mastery, and this is definitely the case for the professional Condottieri. From the 14th century to the end of the 16th, the finest armors, the most elegant helmets, there is really an aesthetics to that. The most luxurious shields, for example, in Europe, were notoriously crafted in Milan by renowned families of armorers, such as the Negrelli and the Missaglia. And so the Lombard capital became a destination for emissaries from all the great European courts who came to purchase tournament and parade armors, as well as weapons for war, sometimes on very large scale, on behalf of their sovereigns. Right? And this business model was, by the way, very much developing in parallel with the Condottieri organization, especially when you consider that Milan had like all this production, and so that was largely also, contracted to satisfy the same Milanese forces. In fact, the specialty of the Milanese, who also served the great Condottieri of the time, was their ability to transform breastplates, helmets, and gorgets into true masterpieces adorned with intricate goldsmith work, featuring miniature sculptures and exquisitely refined engravings that actually had an underappreciated psychological effects among these Condottieri that truly thought, together with the aforementioned classical nostalgia, to be heroes of the past, who were essentially heading towards a direction of classical grandeur, but still very much fueled by a true medieval civilization like this one were. And definitely this craft of arms was as technical as important was even to show off, like in this very, very practical, very masterpieces, like the top panoply available at the time. And so even today, just a short walk from the Duomo of Milan, one can find the streets Armorari, Speronari, and Spadari, that respectively refer to the armorers, the spear makers, the sword makers, commemorating the famous workshops of the Condottieri era. However, the finest blades in Europe originated from the Spanish city of Toledo, which is also worth mentioning. Sometimes we'll have to talk about that, because that's yet another great topic, together with the entire the Damascene, the wood steel, and etc. Now, another aspect about the Condottieri can be interesting, is that in order to be a successful military leader, it was not really enough to be a skilled soldier with a sufficient number of troops at one's command. Right? Equally important were more subtle and even intellectual qualities, foremost among them a solid legal and administrative education. Especially starting from the beginning of the 15th century, as we've seen, state leaders were properly selling their own statal service to other states. Again, there were like the Italian establishment, the patriciate, also the feudal element that still existed, of course, was mastering arms. Like foreign observers said that. The English traveler says every gentleman here trains with the sword and stuff. Consider that there is, in this time, also a great deal of internationalization of European military culture. Think about the great tournaments of the court of Burgundy. Think about the Italian jousts. We'll have to talk about that because it's the Italians that developed actually a great part of tournament culture. They are the ones who put like a barrier between the two knights that are smashing against into one another otherwise, and trying to unhorse each other during the charges. And they are commanders. They have always been fighting as individuals, right? But now there is something else. You're not just a leader of state, you're a condottiere as well. And this needs, of course, a massive background of education. And as we've seen, the highly civilized medieval Italy can provide that. Great banking practice, very high literacy. Medieval Italy was a master in the drafting of contracts, and the condotta was, in fact, a contract that meticulously regulated a crucial matter, that is, the defense of the community against external dangers. Right? There were entire cities that were, as we've seen, entrusting at least great part of their defense to these professionals. They would have had a militia, something that also some other elite professional element, but these guys were the spearhead, the expendables too, but up to a certain point because they cost a lot and battles were not jokes. There was something at stake that would heavily damage, like the possibility, for example, of the city just to survive as an independent polity. So they had to invest carefully and they had to be precise in what they were asking as a military performance to the condottieri. So there was no sparing of any clause or stipulation in these contracts. Specialized professionals known as collaterali emerged to assist both parties and ensure their compliance. Some sort of witnesses and experts in this kind of contracts that counted the men, verified that the equipment matched. There was all probably a logistical issue, like can this condotta work, right? Do they run things well? Because it was entirely private business, right? It was also historically based on one's possessions. We've seen how sort of the various condottieri times emerged from the Italian Apennine and places with were castles, estates, etc. But these were just the basis for a core, for a training. But then you had to go in the lowlands, in the fertile areas, and where the bigger cities were to actually fight the bigger engagements. And there, you were really in between, like pretty remarkable forces that you had to be able to master in a way or another. Well, in this sense, it was needed, right, from your side, just like the Italian city-states cared enormously about their own, meticulously about their own armies' recruitment and armament standards, etc. Like these condottieri were up to the task, right? And they were, especially as a very advanced force. Naturally, the contract of condotta specified in detail not only the compensation in cash or real estate and indemnities in case of work-related injuries, but also the quality, quantity, and of course the price of the sustenance supplies that were to be provided by the client, which of course was in many ways also much greater concern for the condottiere than the city or whichever other power at this point evolving to regional territorial state were really to expect from. So this aspect is also crucial because it shows how, considering that the condotta was basically the most important element in the Italian armies at this time, at least properly the shock force, if not some, larger, like the bulk of the army, right, as an army within the army. You realize that this system had to work so fluidly. This is also what is interesting about these armies, is that it's not just like some adventurer like in the early period that comes by, passes by, and you will just, hire him, on the spot and just, okay, help me capture that castle, fight this battle. Everything was sort of more complicated already from before. But here, everything works through that system. And there are sort of different solutions also to, not to completely depend on the condottieri, of course, because it is true to some extent that these guys were, trying to reason not just as, subjects, but as professionals, but also as businessmen. Like, the destruction of an entire army was hopefully not to be achieved. The same John Oakwood, for example, was, very careful at that. He was so able not to lose, especially during his retreats, like his army, and it was even more successful at that basically, even in his victories, right? So there is a lot of politics going on, but if you look at when this sort of rigs the system, it's an exception, not the rule. Like, all these armies work well, and it's not because you have even such a great voice like Machiavelli, that this is essentially how the system was, and we know it too well, as a matter of fact. And in fact, aside from the infamous myth of the terrible condottieri and their whims, etc., we do not really have any evidence to contrast the idea that this was an incredibly advanced, effective, and also pretty brutal system. I mean, the notion that the condottieri did spare each other in the sense that they would avoid bloodshed to begin with is a complete myth. But we know that the condottieri battles were particularly lethal, and this would have not been otherwise. Also, considering the greatest, forces of Europe at the time, you see this also in other countries, by the way, that there is a tendency often to say, let's not engage because let's avoid bloodshed, right, at some point. But it's a political reason. It's a Clausewitzian connection. It's not a military quality. And so we will see. We've seen it at Molinella, for example. We will see it now in the non-spoiler battle that I'm researching on for Schwerpunkt, that these forces beat each other pretty darn hard, right? And that weren't really that gentle with one another, trying not to harm or not to cause particular losses, which is obvious considering the aim of war, generally speaking. Like, what are you even fighting for at that point, right? Battles existed, they fought, we know of the losses, and this is very very important. I would say that it's all the more interesting to discuss them. And again, I decided to start this. I don't know, I still haven't prepared another video because I haven't arrived at that part of the cycle, but we will start a series about 14th, 15th century Italy, because I presume that I would get more views even if I talk about that here I'm inserting just because essentially I haven't, like, through the cycle, for some reason I haven't discussed the Condottieri period that often, right? So my idea is that since this is more popularized, especially my American audience is probably better familiarized with the Condottieri with the earlier communal armies, I think we can sort of fill this gap and sort of to intertwine better the entire system, which is again something that I would imagine to be particularly beneficial for our effort here. So what to say? There would be so much to say about this all. We approximated brutally when it comes to the Condottieri Armour Organization. As you understand, here we covered essentially almost more than 200 years, which are a lot, of course. And of course, what I was thinking today before making this video was to actually stress, I don't know how many of you follow me till the end, but that of course, like, we have this idea of the Condottieri, even in a sense, that dominates the sense, this is the Italian battlefields, right? If you see how, I don't know, they were fighting in Germany or in Poland or in Castile, it's pretty similar. Like, it's not as the Italians did it in such a regulated fashion through these regional states as armies within armies, granted. But this is also, say, the way eventually these guys fight is pretty similar at the end of the day. There is something that here pertains mostly to the fact that there are different polities that are rich, and they start also allowing for its own people fundamentally to participate to these condottas, that thus establish a permanent force like in other bigger countries that are more politically united, but the result being sort of the same, and given the great Italian advancement in this all, actually also topping the condottieri quality, as we've seen. There were more Germans even. There are 10,000 German men-at-arms at the disposal of central northern Italy in the early 14th century. There is no... It's immense just by numbers. Milan alone, 5,000-6,000 men-at-arms. Only the King of France can hope to field so much. The Venetian condotta, model for the rest of Europe, even the Burgundian army gets from there. So we're talking about an immense legacy that gets often misunderstood, because this topic, I think, gets down to, this is just basically the Italians doing their own stuff. But aside from the previous intertwinements with the foreigners, they weren't just, as we've seen, simply by-walkers that happened to be in Italy for no reason, and also just simply tyrannizing it, because that's another issue. There is a sense that this is what just Italy did within itself. It's just something exceptional in a way, in the exceptuation sense of compared with what you should learn or not. The same idea again of free companies tyrannizing the peninsula is not correct. It's if anything, a product of the almost Black Legion revolving around the condottieri, the era as a whole, because of, again, historiographical issues that we will not digress on, and that do not render justice to the period in any meaningful way. The condottieri are going to be misrepresented, doesn't matter what. This is normal for every historical topic, but I'm glad that we could address the whole picture. I can naturally think of lots of things now that we could point out, but I believe that the video is fairly long for today by itself already, so that I'll stop it here for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.